Great. So, yes, Joe, you mentioned about the criticality of tin not being classified in the EU. I mean, both you and Thomas have projects in both the EU and Australia. Can you sort of try to answer why you think that the EU hasn't classified tin?
And Australia.
And Australia.
They're probably the two economies that have somehow missed it, which I think I said in my speech, we're confused by it. If you look at the data, you look at the assessment criteria, it looks like in both countries, I think we're both probably more strong of the view than the short-term Australia will add it to its list. Certainly be some comments by government ministers that would inform that, and there is meant to be a list refreshed by the end of the year, although I suspect it'll be early next year. When it comes to the EU, I cannot speak on authority as to why, although there were certainly some pretty significant attempts in the back, or probably about mid-year, from a number of members, from members from various countries, Poland, Germany, Spain. They all had an attempt to adjust to get tin on the list and made some very compelling cases, but as far as we've seen in the media, and will soon be fully passed, tin's not on it.
Great, thank you. And I have a question for Thomas as well. Do you have offtake agreements for your German and Australian production? There's also a suggestion here, is Arubis getting into primary tin production? Would you know from your past experience? But
maybe starting with the last part of the question. So sorry, I can't answer about our Arubis because I'm not any part of that. So maybe you direct that question to their press officer about tin. What they do is to produce tin out of recycling, and they're really a big player with their Belgium entities. Coming back to the question of offtake contracts, no, we didn't sign any offtake contract so far, but due to the reason that we are coming closer to the end of the DFS, so the visibility of how much metal will become produced and how the quality of the concentrate looks like, we are coming closer to the discussion and to finalize the discussions for offtake contracts. On top of that, I didn't mention it during my presentation. In Australia, for sure, we do as well a little study for, let's say, a small smelter, because like everywhere in the developed countries, Joe mentioned it for Spain, the governments are interested in to re-establish, let's take maybe that phrase, a mine to metal approach, so to get a grip as well onto the final metal. So that's as well where we do some investigation about, but there are all options often, so from offtake contracts, direct offtake from smelters, where there is lack of smelting capacity in, let's say, good legislation countries, fulfilling as well the attempt of the mining producers to fulfill the ESG requirements, because that will become important. Something, by the way, most probably neglected so far by most of the tin users. So they will wake up next year when they have to report their raw material supply chain, in particular in regards to conflict material. So for a very little tiny volume, they will most probably benefit a lot of headaches.
Great, thank you. And a question, I think, mainly for Christopher here. So do we expect to see more dredging in Malaysia, Indonesia, Bangka, as onshore alluvial deposits are depleted? OPEX is presumably much lower than hard rock.
Yeah, well, the problem is that you're having to go offshore. And these new dredges are virtually night and day with the old dredges. The old dredges were shallow. They operated in a river where you weren't subject to gigantic waves. And now they're having to go offshore. And initially, they've been just off the beach. But now we're starting to get a situation like they have in Namibia with the diamond mining offshore, where you've got to have really big dredges that can withstand rough conditions, but you also can't operate the way you used to, because in the river you could have a pipe that went a few hundred meters to the shore, well, less than a few hundred meters, a few tens of meters to the shore, where you could be piping the material where it could get processed and then pumped back into the river. Here you've got to be offshore. You've got to have either store it on the dredge, but probably not. But you've got to then, using flotation devices, keep a pipeline up, send it to the shore. It's all sorts of complications there, and the cost is going up. Dredging in rivers was quite literally done by old rust buckets. And you see some of the photos of these things in there. They didn't change for like 150 years, except they had electricity added to them. But the offshore dredges are now, you know, sort of space age. But at that high ticket price, they're expensive for the operators. And, you know, the product, once it's out of the river where it's relatively concentrated, and it's out in the sea, the grades are going down as well, because, you know, the material gets dissipated when it comes out of the river into the sea, and it's this sort of alluvial product that's been washed out of rivers that they're really after. But there are limitations to that once it gets into the sea.
Great, thank you very much. Then actually a question from me for Thomas. So you talked about renewable energy at your Australian project. Presumably this will help give you some immunity from some volatility in fuel prices as well.
Yeah, so we came to, first for sure, we screened the region to identify the most simple way to get access to energy. And there are different lines available close to our project in Australia, so 33 megawatts, 66 megawatts to hook in the distance of, let's say, 3 to 6 kilometers, which is rather low and small. So that's the simplest way to get access to the grid, but we are talking, at least if it comes then to the calculation, it turns out that the megawatt hour is in the range, let's say, of 280 to 300 Aussie dollars per megawatt hour, which is high cost. So this is something not to neglect. And that brought us to the idea, due to the reason that we have a very large footprint, and the region where we are provides a lot of sun and wind, to do a study to generate renewable energy, and at least ticking two boxes. One is, because that's the aim, to get low-cost energy supply. And second, it ticks as well the reliability in regards of CO2 carbon footprint, which will become an important question as well, then looking the whole supply chain for tin. And looking preliminary figures, so it might lead to roughly halving the energy price, which is a substantial move and an opportunity indeed. That doesn't say anything, we will do it, a partner will do it, whatever the project will look like, because my personal opinion is as well to focus in order to make the project happen, and the focus is mining.
Yeah, of course, yes. Great, thank you very much. And a question for myself as well, for Joe. So your Oropesa project has been classified as strategically important, is it, for the Andalusian government? What kind of differences do you see between the regulatory environment in Spain and in Australia? Sorry, tough question.
That's okay. Firstly, without getting too deep into it, Spain doesn't have a national regulation. The regions are autonomous, so all our approvals are Andalusian approvals. There's no national level, which is a key difference from operating in other jurisdictions. So to have that Andalusian, we're in their project accelerator unit, to be in that is the ultimate support from the people that are eventually going to give you your licenses, right? Both environmental, exploitation and water licenses. So for us to have that support is significant. Australia, you generally have state-based approvals and national-based approvals, so that's a significant difference. But they're both very mature mining regions. I'm actually always surprised by the similarities between the mining laws, the regulations, and just the general requirements from even statutory, how you operate your exploration lease when you're doing drilling, through to the mining license application. There's more similarities than differences across the regions when you get into these mature mining regions.
Great, thank you. And I have a question here for Christopher. So we'll have a presentation focusing more on the tin code and ESG from Myra later. But for you. How much do ESG criteria factor into investor decisions?
Into retail investors, almost not at all. And as we've seen from the companies that have been here today, institutions are not really dabbling much in the tin space. I saw one shareholder, one company had Baker Steel as a shareholder, but which is sort of like a well-known name in the institutional space. But the rest of the tin space has largely been left to retail investors, and frankly, they don't care too much. So government, it's probably from above that the pressure comes rather than from underneath for the mining companies. But then you look at where the companies are operating. Latin America is doing things on ESG, but not all that intensely. But when you're talking about Spain or Germany or Australia, the companies, they're sort of ESG compliant already because they have been for decades. ESG as a concept may have just appeared in the last few years, or as an acronym, but it used to be called good corporate governance or good environmental policy or good neighbour policy. So they've just all been bundled together, and the companies, if they were sensible, have been doing that for a long time. And if you look at an area like Tasmania, I mean, the people there have been mining tin for 150 years. And if you look at Cornwall, a lot longer, 3,000 years. They know their neighbours, and they know they have to get on with them. If you look at South Crofty, it's actually under a town. So you can't be cavalier there. And obviously, there's a lot of support there. So I don't think ESG is much of an issue at the moment. And these institutions, you can jump through a lot of hoops, ticking a lot of boxes for institutions, and then they still don't buy your stock because they find an excuse not to. It's just one of their filters that they use for not buying. And you satisfy all their points, and they've got another reason for not buying, that the company's not hedged, or the market cap's not big enough, or this metal's too small. Any excuse for an institution not to buy.
Great, thank you. And we'll hear much more about ESG in the next session. So thank you very much, Thomas, Joe, and Christopher. I suggest that we go to a short break and reconvene at 11:40 for our third and final session. Thank you very much.